Story 1. It was just another quiet evening, the kind where everything seems ordinary, nothing to set your nerves on edge. I had just finished sorting through some laundry when I felt the need to pick something to wear. The house was still, with only the hum of the refrigerator filling the background. The soft light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room as I opened the door to my closet, expecting the usual view of neatly hung clothes, my shirts, jeans, jackets, all in their familiar order. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. Hanging next to my jacket, a coat I didn't recognize swayed slightly, as though it had always been there. The fabric was dark, a worn leather that seemed to absorb the dim light, and it looked oddly out of place against the backdrop of my otherwise well-kept wardrobe. Its buttons were tarnished, the collar frayed as though it had endured years of use, yet it felt too foreign. I stood frozen, my fingers still gripping the closet door, staring at the coat in disbelief. I had never seen this jacket before, never owned anything like it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I tried to wrap my mind around it. How had it gotten here? A quick glance around the room didn't offer any answers. Maybe one of my friends had left it here. But no, none of them had been over recently. And even if they had, why would anyone leave a coat, this coat, hanging right next to mine, in my closet? Something about it didn't make sense. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step closer, trying to reason with myself, to convince myself it was nothing but a mistake. But the closer I got, the more out of place it seemed. With a hesitant breath, I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold leather. The texture was smoother than I expected, almost unnaturally so. The weight of the jacket surprised me, heavier than it should have been for its size. As I pulled it down, I inspected it more closely. It looked old, but meticulously cared for, as though someone had tended to it with obsessive care. Inside the collar was a faded tag, its logo too worn to make out, leaving me with more questions than answers. No name, no clue as to where it came from. I had never bought anything like this, nor had anyone ever mentioned giving me such a gift. My mind raced, trying to piece together some rational explanation. But there was none. No logical reason for this jacket to be in my closet. I stood there, feeling a strange unease settle over me as I scanned the rest of my clothes. The jacket felt like an intruder, a dark stain on an otherwise peaceful canvas. It didn't belong here. And the longer I looked at it, the more it felt as though it was somehow watching me, waiting for me to understand why it had come into my life. A strange pull kept me tethered to the jacket, urging me to keep it, to not throw it away. But I knew I had to, something told me it was wrong. So I hung it back in the closet, but as I did, the room seemed to shift. A sudden gust of wind swept through, though the windows were tightly shut. I shivered, my hand hovering near the jacket, almost as if something inside me was urging me to touch it again. A subtle tug ran through my arm, as if the jacket itself was trying to draw me closer. I pulled away, convincing myself I had imagined it, but when I looked at the coat again, something had changed. It seemed fuller, more substantial, like it had taken on a presence of its own. I slammed the closet door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating, and I wanted to be anywhere but near that jacket. I forced myself to go about my evening, trying to push the strange thoughts from my mind, but they kept coming back, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The image of the jacket hanging in my closet, dark and ominous, lingered like a shadow in my mind. It was as though it had always been there, waiting for me to find it. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the jacket. Its dark form loomed in my mind, haunting me, as though it were following me even in my dreams. Tossing and turning, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I finally couldn't take it anymore. Around 3 a.m., I got up, my hands trembling as I walked to the closet. When I opened the door, the jacket was still there, exactly where I had left it. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, my mind set on getting rid of it once and for all. But as my fingers touched the cold leather, a wave of icy coldness surged up my arm. My breath hitched as the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air thick with a presence that wasn't mine. I looked at the jacket again, and for the first time, I saw something new. The sleeves were slightly outstretched, as though waiting to be worn. And there, on the shoulder, was the faintest imprint, something like the shape of a handprint, pressing into the fabric. I froze. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The jacket wasn't just a coat anymore. It was something far more sinister, something that had come to claim its place in my life. I didn't hesitate. I shoved it back into the closet and slammed the door shut with all my strength, my heart racing as I backed away. But then, I heard it. A sound so faint, so quiet, that I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. It was the soft rustling of fabric, like the jacket was being worn by an invisible figure. The sound echoed in my mind, growing louder as I turned and ran, not stopping until I was in the living room, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. I glanced back toward the hallway, half expecting to see something, someone, there. But the darkness was still. Quiet. Empty. Yet, deep down, I knew the truth. The jacket wasn't just left behind. It was a warning. A presence that had found its way into my life, and I could feel it lurking, waiting. Waiting for the moment when I would open that door again. Story 2. The evening was calm, the kind of stillness that blankets you after a long, exhausting day. The television was off, and the only sound was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, a rhythmic beat, almost too gentle to hear. I sat there, lost in my thoughts, the fading light outside slowly giving way to night. As was my habit, I glanced toward the window, drawn to the darkening world beyond, when something caught my eye. A shadow. It was quick, almost imperceptible, flitting past just outside. A person? No. It moved too swiftly, too unnaturally, like a blur that shouldn't be there. I froze, staring at the spot where it had been, my heart skipping a beat. I blinked, disoriented, and then, nothing. The yard was empty. I stood up, my legs stiff, a cold unease spreading through me. I hadn't imagined it. That shadow had been real. Something had moved out there, fast, too fast to be a person. I walked to the window, pulling back the curtain with shaky hands, my breath shallow, searching for any sign of movement. The yard, dimly lit by the faint glow of a streetlight across the road, was still. There was no one there, no shape, no sign of life. Just shadows playing tricks in the corners of my mind. I backed away from the window, but the unease was still there, creeping up my spine, a chill settling in my bones. Who had been out there? Why had they vanished so quickly? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, just my mind playing games. But every time I closed my eyes, the shadow came back, vivid and sharp in my mind. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. I found myself walking back to the window, peering out into the night once again, hoping for some reassurance. But the yard remained empty, the darkness swallowing everything whole. The night seemed to stretch on, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I tried to settle into something normal, reading a book, scrolling through my phone, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the window. The shadow. The way it moved, so fluid, deliberate. It didn't make sense. I couldn't shake it. The more I tried, the more it gnawed at me. Around midnight, the house felt suffocating. A heavy silence hung in the air, and restlessness clawed at my insides. I had to check again. I pulled the curtain back slowly, my pulse quickening, and there it was. That same shadow, creeping just at the edge of my vision. It moved too quickly, too inhumanly fast for it to be anyone walking. My breath hitched in my chest. This wasn't right. I jerked away from the window, panic rising in my throat. No way. This wasn't normal. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize it, but my mind refused to obey. There was no explanation for what I was seeing. The shadow had been there again, and this time it was closer. Much closer. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, dialing the number of a friend, desperate for someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. But the call wouldn't go through. The screen flickered and went blank, showing no signal. I tried again, then again, but each time, the result was the same. Blank. The cold air in the room thickened, and suddenly, it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. The feeling of being watched crept back, more intense than before, as if that shadow was out there, waiting for me to look again. It was all too much. I sat there for hours, staring at the window, listening to the house creak and groan around me, but no shadow came. The house was frozen in time, like some strange limbo where nothing moved, nothing breathed. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, the shadow, moving across the yard, too fast to catch. Dawn eventually arrived, but sleep was out of reach. The unease lingered, like an invisible presence that wouldn't let go. The days passed, and the shadow began to feel like a distant memory, a trick of my imagination. But that feeling of being watched, it never left. It haunted me. And every night, without fail, I found myself checking the window again. Because deep down, I knew. I knew it wasn't over. The shadow would come back. It always does. And when it does, I'll be waiting. Story 3. It was one of those nights when the weight of the world feels a little heavier, when the silence of the house wraps around you like a thick, suffocating blanket. The evening had slowly slipped into night, and I was curled up on the couch, scrolling through my phone, seeking distraction after a long, exhausting day. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that pierced the stillness, accompanied by the occasional creak of the floorboards as if the house itself were trying to speak. I was alone, and for once, that was fine by me. My mind had been buzzing all day, and all I wanted now was peace. I checked my messages, nothing unusual. Just the usual notifications. But then, a new message popped up from an unknown number. My thumb hovered over the screen as I glanced at the text, a chill spreading through me with every word. It was short, direct, and sent a sharp spike of dread into my chest. You can't hide from me forever. At first, I thought it was just some weird prank, or a wrong number, maybe even a friend messing with me. I skimmed it again, but there was no context, no explanation, just those unsettling words. The number was unfamiliar, completely unrecognizable. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing. Just a mistake, probably. But even as I told myself that, I felt the familiar, creeping sense of unease slither into my thoughts, making me feel watched. I locked my phone and set it down on the table, attempting to distract myself, but those words echoed through my mind. You can't hide from me forever. I tried to push the thought away, brushing it off as nothing more than my imagination running wild. After all, it could just be some scam or a joke, right? Still, that feeling, it wouldn't leave. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I got up to make myself a drink, desperate to shake the weird tension clinging to the air. But then, as I walked across the room, my phone lit up again. I froze. The same unknown number. The same inexplicable sense of dread clawed at me. Hesitating, I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I unlocked the screen. The message read, "I know where you are." My blood turned to ice. I felt my breath catch in my throat as a wave of cold fear washed over me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands shook so badly that I almost dropped my phone. I glanced around the room, my gaze darting to every shadow, every corner of the space, half expecting someone to be lurking just out of sight. How could they possibly know where I was? I was completely alone. I checked the number again. A string of unfamiliar digits stared back at me, offering no clue, no comfort. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. The feeling of being watched was so intense, I could almost feel eyes on me. I had been living alone for a while, and while I was used to the solitude, this was different, this was wrong. I tried calling the number, my pulse racing in my throat, but it went straight to voicemail. No one answered. I sent a text back, demanding an explanation. Nothing. I was alone, and yet I wasn't. The walls of my house suddenly felt too thin, as though the air itself were heavy with something unseen. I locked every door and window, checking and rechecking, but the dread that had settled in my chest wouldn't lift. Every little sound, the howl of the wind outside, the creak of the old house, made me jump. It was like the house was alive with something sinister, something waiting. But then, in the dead of night, the message came again. You can't escape me. I stared at the screen, my mind frozen in a moment of pure terror. This wasn't just a prank anymore. The words felt like a promise. A threat. The tension in my chest tightened until it felt like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't stay there, not with that horrible feeling clinging to me like a second skin. I grabbed my jacket and fled the house, driving aimlessly, hoping the movement would somehow make the unease go away. But my phone stayed silent, and the feeling of being hunted never lifted. When I finally returned home, the house was still, eerily still. The air was thick with a tension I couldn't shake. I checked my phone once more, hoping for a sign of relief, but there was nothing. It was as though the night had swallowed everything. But something in the air had shifted. I could feel it. The house, the world, seemed wrong. It wasn't until the next morning that I saw it. The security footage. There, on the video from the night before, I saw myself walking toward the door, leaving the house, my mind consumed by dread. But I wasn't alone. No, behind me, lingering in the shadows just out of view, was a figure. A shadowy silhouette that moved with me, never too close but always just behind, as if waiting for the right moment. It hadn't been there when I left, but it was there, waiting. The timestamp told me that figure had been there long before I got the text message. It had been there, watching me, lurking in the dark. The message was a warning. A threat that had been hanging in the air long before I realized it. I couldn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow. Every corner of my house became a hiding place for something unseen. I checked and rechecked every lock, every window, every shadow, convinced that something was out there, waiting for me. The messages stopped for a while, but I knew better now. I knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I could never escape it. I couldn't hide. Story 4. I was sorting through an old box of forgotten photographs in the attic when something strange caught my eye. Buried under a pile of dust-covered memories, there was a photo I had never seen before. It was of me, standing in a place I couldn't recognize. The image had an eerie quality to it, the edges curled slightly, and the colors were faded, but there was no mistaking that it was me. The background, though, was entirely unfamiliar. The buildings looked ancient, the trees twisted in ways I'd never seen, and the ground beneath my feet was blanketed with a thick layer of snow, a sight I had never experienced. I had never traveled to cold, snowy places like that. In fact, I avoided anything that took me far from the places I knew, so how could I have been there? The photo felt completely out of place, like it didn't belong. But there I was, smiling, standing like it was the most normal thing in the world. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to place it in my mind, but nothing came to me. There was no memory of ever visiting such a place. I traced my fingers over the edges of the photo, my mind racing. Had this photo been misplaced? Why had I never seen it before? There was no way I could have traveled there, and yet, there I was. I was a creature of habit, always following my routines. The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. The more I tried to piece it together, the more I felt like I was sinking into some deep, unreachable void. My hands trembled as I placed the photo down on the table, trying to push away the creeping unease that washed over me. I studied it again, but the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. It wasn't just the strange setting, it was the way I looked. Too calm, too serene. How could someone be that relaxed in a place they didn't remember? How could I have posed for this picture, smiling, when everything about it felt alien? I needed answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister hiding beneath the surface, something I wasn't meant to understand. My mind refused to let go of the image. I found my mother in the kitchen, handed her the photo without a word. She studied it for what felt like an eternity, her brow furrowed, her gaze locked on it as if it were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice shaky, a hint of worry creeping in. "In the attic," I said. "Do you recognize it?" She shook her head, her face growing darker. "No. We've never been there. Not like that anyway." Her voice wavered, just enough to make my stomach tighten. I stared at her, searching her face for some kind of explanation. She'd always been calm, too calm. But this? This was different. "But I'm in the photo," I said. "It's me. How could I have been there if we never went?" She avoided my gaze, her eyes flickering to the floor. "Maybe it's an old family photo. Something from before you were born," she suggested, but there was no conviction in her voice. It didn't feel right. It felt like she was hiding something, something she wasn't ready to share. I didn't press her further. Something told me I wasn't going to get the answers I was looking for. But I couldn't stop thinking about the photo, about the place in the background that felt so unfamiliar, yet so hauntingly real. Later that night, I found myself back in the attic, my mind a whirlwind of questions. The dust hung thick in the air, the room cloaked in shadows, as I sifted through boxes in search of anything that could explain what I had found. And then I saw it, another photo. This one, like the first, felt wrong. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up. The setting was different, but it was unmistakably me, standing on a busy city street this time. But the expression on my face, the same calm serenity, the same unnerving smile, was exactly the same as in the first photo. The place was strange, unfamiliar. I had never been there. A feeling of dread settled in my chest. How was this possible? How could there be more photos of me in places I had no memory of? What was happening to me? I rushed downstairs, my hands trembling as I clutched both photos. When I showed my mother the second photo, her face drained of color. "Where did you find this one?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the attic," I said, the words escaping me in a rush. How is this possible? How could I have been in these places when I have no memory of them? My mother looked at the photo for a long time, her expression unreadable. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "When you were young, you used to wander off. We'd find you in places you'd never been, places we couldn't explain. And you never remembered how you got there." A chill crept up my spine. I stared at her, not sure if I'd heard her correctly. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Sometimes we'd find you in places far from home, places that didn't make sense. And when you came back, you had no memory of it at all. We thought it was just your imagination, but now..." She trailed off, her voice trembling. "Now, I'm not so sure." A cold, suffocating realization gripped me. The photos weren't some trick of my memory. They were proof of something far darker, far more terrifying. I had been to these places. I had been there, and yet I had no recollection of it. How had I gotten there? Why couldn't I remember? And why had I never been told? The photos felt heavier now, their weight pressing down on my chest, the truth hanging over me like a shadow. Whatever had happened, it wasn't just a coincidence. Something was at play, something I couldn't explain, and I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover the truth. But deep down, I knew I had no choice. The answers were out there, waiting for me to find them. Story 5. I woke up to the quiet stillness of the early morning. My eyes fluttered open, the soft light from the window spilling across the room like a gentle touch. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the exhaustion of the days before, but I slowly stretched, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Reaching for my phone, I hoped to check the time and get a sense of the world outside my cocoon of warmth. But when I unlocked the screen, something was horribly wrong. The usual stream of notifications, messages, and reminders was gone. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold, a live video feed of me, lying in bed, asleep. My body went rigid, my heart stuttering in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen in disbelief. The video was unnervingly clear, too clear. It was me, exactly as I had been moments ago, curled under the covers, still in the depths of sleep. But I didn't understand. I didn't remember recording anything, and I certainly hadn't given anyone access to my phone. Panic gripped me as my mind raced in a blur of confusion and terror. How could this be happening? Who was watching me? The video continued to play, and the horror deepened. This wasn't just a random video clip, it was a live stream. I could see myself, slightly shifting in my sleep, my chest rising and falling with each slow breath. I realized, with growing dread, that someone was watching me in real time. My heart hammered against my ribs. Someone had access to my phone, to my life. They were watching me sleep, tracking my every move. Desperation surged through me as I frantically swiped the screen, trying to stop the video. But it wouldn't respond. It was as though the phone had a mind of its own, trapped in some eerie, endless loop. The video played on, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to do something, anything, but my hands trembled and refused to obey. My body reacted before my mind could process. I leapt from the bed, my pulse racing. I checked the room, scanning for anything out of place, any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing. No open windows. No doors ajar. Just the quiet of the early morning. But the longer I looked around, the more my skin crawled. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. The thought made my stomach twist with cold, sharp fear. I clutched my phone and tried again to close the video, but nothing worked. The screen remained frozen, stubborn, as if it were being controlled from some unseen place. And then, just as the dread was suffocating me, a message appeared. Simple. Innocent. But it sent an icy shiver through my spine. Sleep tight. I nearly dropped the phone in shock, my mind spinning. How? How could someone have gotten access to my phone without me knowing? I'd always been so careful about my security, so meticulous. This was something beyond anything I could fathom. The enormity of it hit me like a wave. Someone had been inside my personal space, had invaded my privacy in the most terrifying way possible. I stumbled into the living room, still clutching my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to call someone. Anyone. My fingers fumbled as I dialed the police, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen froze again, glitching as though it were mocking me. I checked the signal, there was nothing wrong there. I tried again, over and over, but each time, the call failed. It was as though my phone was no longer mine. I was no longer in control of it. Desperation began to overtake me. I was trapped, alone in a nightmare I didn't understand. The video played on, a haunting reminder that I was being watched, that I had no place to hide. I had to escape. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here, not with the constant feeling of being hunted. With no plan and no clear direction, I decided to leave. I had to find safety, even if I didn't know where that was. As I made my way toward the door, a new wave of horror struck me. The video on my phone had changed. It wasn't showing me asleep anymore. No. Now it was showing me standing in the living room, looking at the phone in my hand. It was as if whoever was controlling it knew exactly what I was doing. Every moment. Every move. The chilling realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching me. They were manipulating everything. They could see my every move. They were toying with me, pushing me, testing my limits. I grabbed my keys, left my apartment, and hurried down the hallway. My mind raced as I tried to shake the growing sense of dread that clung to me. I couldn't bring myself to check my phone again. I couldn't bear to know what new horrors it might reveal. But as I stepped into the cold night air, I heard a familiar sound, the buzz of my phone. Hesitantly, I glanced down, dreading what awaited me. The screen lit up with a new message. My hands shook as I opened it, the words searing into my mind like a brand: "You're not alone anymore." A cold sweat broke out across my body. The world around me seemed to close in, suffocating me. As I realized the truth, I couldn't escape this. I wasn't just being hunted by a person. No. Something, or someone, knew far more than I was willing to admit. I had no answers. No way to fight back. And no way to know who was pulling the strings. All I knew was that I wasn't safe anymore. And that terrifying truth followed me, lurking in the shadows, with every step I took. Story 6. It started like any other night, with the quiet calm that usually accompanies a deep, peaceful sleep. But that night was different. I woke with a start, my heart racing, as my eyes locked onto something that didn't belong. Under my pillow, neatly folded, was a note. It was simple in its appearance, paper folded with care, but its contents, its message, were anything but. The words on the page read, "I'm waiting for you." The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as though it had been written in haste, yet with a sort of twisted precision, as if every stroke carried some haunting weight. My fingers trembled as I held it, the cold chill creeping up my spine, spreading outward. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I hadn't been expecting any messages. I didn't even know what to make of it. I turned the note over, half hoping for some explanation, some clue that could make sense of this madness. But there was nothing. No signature. Just one cryptic word: waiting. A lump formed in my throat, and for a moment, the room felt suffocating, as though the very air had grown heavier. My mind raced to find any connection, to any person, any memory that could explain why someone would leave such a message for me. But nothing came. My mind was a blank slate. I hadn't had any visitors recently. I hadn't invited anyone to stay. I convinced myself it was a prank, a strange joke, something harmless. But as the night dragged on, those words haunted me. "I'm waiting for you." They echoed in my head, growing louder the more I tried to ignore them, pulling at the corners of my thoughts, refusing to let me sleep. It was as if the note itself was alive, a presence that wouldn't let go. The next day, I scoured the house. Every corner, every room, every closet. I checked the windows and the doors, looking for some sign that someone had been inside. But everything was locked. Everything seemed secure. And yet, there was a feeling that lingered in the air: something was wrong. Something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, had been watching me, even if I hadn't seen them. That night, the feeling grew stronger. The air felt thicker, colder. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, but sleep wouldn't come. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. That something was waiting. As the night deepened, I heard it. The faintest sound, barely noticeable, but unmistakable, a creak. A soft, slow creak, like someone stepping carefully across the floorboards in the hallway. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The house was too quiet, too still. The noise came again, closer this time. I sat up, straining my ears, every muscle in my body tense. Someone was in the house. The whisper of my breath was the only sound I could hear. And then, it came. A voice. Low, almost gentle, yet carrying a malevolent weight that sent a shiver straight through me. "I'm waiting for you." I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't. The whisper came again, louder this time, clearer, as if the voice were standing right outside my door. Without thinking, I leapt from the bed and ran to the door. I threw it open, my pulse racing, expecting to find someone, anyone, standing there. A stranger. A friend. But the hallway was empty, shrouded in darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. I stepped into the hallway, my breath shallow, my footsteps muffled on the carpet. The air was colder now, thick with a strange tension, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath. I moved cautiously, my heart in my throat, and reached the end of the hallway. There, at the last door, the one that led to the attic, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper was wedged under the door, the same as the note from my pillow. Trembling, I bent down and picked it up, my fingers shaking as I unfolded it. "I'm still waiting." The same jagged handwriting. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I turned the handle of the attic door, my palms slick with sweat. The door creaked open slowly, protesting with a shrill noise that seemed too loud in the stillness of the house. The attic was just as I had left it, dusty, untouched. But something was wrong. There was an oppressive heaviness in the air, as if something, someone, had changed the atmosphere, had settled in like an unwanted presence. I scanned the shadows, half expecting to see something move. But nothing. Only darkness and the faint smell of mildew. But then I saw it. In the far corner, half hidden in the darkness, a shape. A figure. Barely visible, but unmistakable. My heart stopped. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still, silent, waiting. The air grew colder, the space around me thickening as if it were closing in. I could feel the weight of the presence pressing against me. Then, the voice again, soft and low, right behind me. "I'm waiting for you." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Nothing but shadows and dust. My mind raced, my pulse quickening with every breath. This wasn't a prank. Someone, something, had been waiting for me. And it wasn't going to stop. Panicked, I backed away, stumbling towards the door. I ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I locked it, breathing heavily, my mind spinning in terror and confusion. I didn't know what was happening, who or what was leaving these notes. But I knew one thing for sure, I was being hunted. And whatever it was, it wouldn't stop until it had me. I don't know what's waiting for me, but I can feel it now. I hear it in the whispers, feel it in the darkness that follows me wherever I go. It's always waiting, always near. And I don't think I'll ever escape. Story 7. It was a late evening, the kind of quiet night that wraps itself around you like a blanket. The warm glow from the living room light cast soft, familiar shadows on the walls. I had just finished dinner and was about to settle in for a night of peace, when something caught my eye through the window. At first, I dismissed it, probably just the wind playing tricks with the branches. But as I squinted, my heart skipped a beat. There was a figure, standing just outside my house. I froze, staring at the shape that seemed almost too distinct to be a trick of the light. It stood there, motionless, like a dark sculpture carved into the shadows of my front yard. The figure didn't shift even an inch. It was so still, so unnervingly still, it felt wrong. The street had been empty earlier. No cars, no voices, nothing. I hadn't heard a single footstep, no knock on the door, nothing that would have explained its presence. I leaned forward, my heart pounding, trying to make out any details, anything to give me a sense of normalcy. But the figure was too far away. I couldn't see its face or any clear features. It wasn't facing the window, but its body was angled in such a way that it seemed to be staring directly at my house. A shiver crawled down my spine. It was like the thing knew I was there, knew I was watching. Panic surged through me, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. It felt as if something had crawled into my home, settled into the walls, and was now waiting, watching, its unseen eyes boring into me from the darkness outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a neighbor, perhaps, or just my imagination. But something about the way it stood there, motionless and unyielding, stirred a deep unease in my chest. I turned away from the window, desperate to shake off the feeling gnawing at my mind. But every few seconds, my eyes betrayed me, darting back to the figure. It hadn't moved. It was still there, like a dark stain in the night, blending into the shadows but standing out with a presence far too deliberate. I checked the locks on every door, double-checked the windows. The house felt eerily quiet. So quiet, I could hear the sound of my own breath, too loud, too harsh. A thought crossed my mind, should I call someone? But what would I even say? Hello, someone standing outside my window, not doing anything, just staring. It sounded ridiculous, absurd even, but with every passing second, the unease grew stronger, heavier, more real. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my spiraling thoughts. I jumped, startled, and fumbled to pull it out, praying for a distraction. But there was nothing, no messages, no calls, just the glowing emptiness of my screen. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, hoping it would calm me, but every time I looked up, I saw it again. The figure. Standing there, still as a statue, unmoving, unblinking, daring me to make a move. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check again. My legs felt shaky as I stood up, my body fighting against the overwhelming urge to flee, to lock myself away somewhere far from the window. But something in me needed to know. Was it real? Or was my mind just playing tricks? I walked back to the window, my breath shallow. The figure was still there. But it had moved closer. Somehow, without a sound, without even a whisper of movement, it had crossed the yard. The air in my chest went cold, and my heart skipped. It had gotten closer to the house. Too close. A terror I couldn't explain clawed at my insides. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. Was it human? Was it something else? My mind raced with terrifying possibilities, none of them good. I backed away slowly, trying to pull myself together, but every instinct in me screamed to flee. To leave the house, to lock every door, to never look outside again. Yet, I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't gone either. It was still there, its presence heavier than the darkened night around it, its eyes never leaving mine, like it had all the time in the world to wait. And then, as if it had been waiting for the right moment, it moved. But not suddenly, not with the sharp jolt of an attack. No. It shifted, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. Its eyes never left the window, never broke their gaze as it turned its body. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I thought it might step toward the house, walk into the light, but instead, it just turned and began to walk away. It moved, but there was no sound. No crunch of gravel, no rustle of leaves, no footsteps. Just pure, suffocating silence. It disappeared into the darkness of the yard, as quietly as it had appeared, like it had never been there at all. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to look away. Finally, when I couldn't take it any longer, I exhaled, realizing it was gone. But even then, something inside me refused to believe it had truly left. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. I locked every door, every window, checking them again and again as if that could keep it away. Sitting in the living room, the lights on, I tried to calm myself, but fear stretched my nerves thin. I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't know who or what that figure had been. But I knew one thing for certain, it wouldn't be the last time I felt its eyes on me. Story 8. I sat at the kitchen table, cradling my mug of coffee, the warmth trying to chase away the last remnants of sleep. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that wrapped around you like a thick, suffocating blanket. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound almost comforting in its predictability. I glanced up at it absent-mindedly, my gaze drifting between the hands and the clock face, but something was wrong. I blinked hard, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, but it didn't go away. The hands were moving backward. Slowly, deliberately, they crawled in reverse, defying all reason. At first, I thought I must be imagining it. Maybe it was just the grogginess messing with my mind. But no. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my vision, and when I looked again, they were still moving, backward. The second hand twitched unnervingly, jerking with unnatural hesitation, its tick-tock becoming faint and almost fearful, as if unsure of its purpose. A chill ran down my spine. Something was horribly wrong. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the clock. The time on the face, no, it wasn't just shifting a few seconds back. It was like time itself was unraveling, stretching back into something that didn't make sense. It wasn't just moments reversing, it was as if every second, every minute, was being swallowed by an unseen force. The hands moved faster, frantically trying to undo everything that had already happened. My heart pounded in my chest as the room seemed to warp around me, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. The clock's hands froze, frozen at 8:23 a.m., a time I knew I had never seen before. I stood up, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. I checked my phone. It was 10:17 a.m. The clock, however, remained stubbornly stuck at 8:23, mocking me with its inexplicable anomaly. Panic crept up my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just a malfunction, a glitch, maybe a dying battery. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't right. There was something more, something I couldn't explain, but it was there, crawling in the air, whispering that something was terribly, horribly wrong. I walked over to the clock, my fingers reaching out to adjust it, to force it back to its proper time, but the moment my hand touched the surface, an icy cold shot through me. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, as if the clock itself was alive, aware of my touch, of my presence. I recoiled, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. I didn't understand it, but I didn't want to be near that clock any longer. But as I stepped back, something even stranger happened. The room around me, the kitchen I knew so well, felt wrong. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The familiar, warm tones of the space were gone, replaced by something duller, colder. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, sharp, as though the very fabric of the room had shifted. It wasn't my kitchen anymore, not in the way I knew it. I had stepped into some alternate version, a mirror of my reality, but twisted, distorted. Panic gripped my chest as I frantically scanned the room. The clock ticked again, but now it was stuck at 8:23 a.m., unmoving, frozen. I checked my phone again, still 10:17 a.m. But everything around me had changed. Then, I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. A presence, looming just behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I spun around, but the room was empty, completely, eerily empty. There was no one there. And yet, the feeling remained, that gnawing certainty that something was watching me, something that shouldn't be. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around, searching for the source of the unease. The ticking of the clock, slow and maddening, was the only sound in the room. It felt like it was growing louder, more insistent, pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just had to get out of there. I moved toward the door, my feet heavy, reluctant. The house itself seemed to be trying to keep me inside, to trap me. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, but before I could turn it, I heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, lost beneath the ticking of the clock. I froze. My hand hovered above the handle, straining to hear. The whisper came again, clearer this time, as though it was being drawn from the very walls around me. It was coming from the direction of the clock. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I could feel it, someone, was trying to reach out from the other side, something that didn't belong, something that shouldn't be here. My heart hammered painfully in my chest as I turned, my eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. Still, the presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. The clock's ticking, now louder and more relentless, filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I couldn't escape it, couldn't break free from the feeling that something was pulling me back, pulling me toward that frozen moment, that time I had never seen. I reached the door again, twisting the handle with all my strength. But it wouldn't budge. It was like something was pressing against it, holding it shut, keeping me in that room, in that moment. I yanked and pulled, my muscles straining, but the door stayed locked. The sound of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else as I pounded on the door, shouting, screaming for help, but there was nothing. No response. Just the deafening tick-tock of the clock. I turned back to it, helpless. And then, I saw it. Something was moving inside the glass. A shadow. A figure, flickering, twitching behind the surface of the clock, as if it were trapped, trying to escape. It was unnatural, its movements jerky and disjointed, like nothing I had ever seen before. My breath caught in my throat as I realized, the figure wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be. The clock's hands began to move again, but this time, they moved further back, farther and farther into the past. Each tick felt like a step closer to something I wasn't ready to face. The room around me began to blur, and with each passing second, I felt my body growing weaker, my energy draining away. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But when I turned to the door again, the whispering started once more. This time, it wasn't one voice. It was a chorus, hundreds of voices, calling my name, pulling me toward the clock. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out everything. I stumbled backward, unable to stop myself, my vision spinning, the room warping around me. And then, it all stopped. The room snapped back into focus. The clock was ticking normally again, the time fixed in place. I looked around, disoriented, gasping for air, but nothing had changed. The clock was back to its usual rhythm. The air was lighter, and the whispering had stopped. It was as if everything had returned to normal, but I knew it hadn't. The mark of the past, that strange, unsettling moment, still lingered in the air, heavy and thick. I didn't understand what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure, that clock wasn't ordinary. It had shown me something beyond time itself, and I was terrified to know what it would do next. Story 9. I found a scrap of paper in my bag one evening, crumpled and folded, as though it had been lurking there for months, unnoticed. I didn't remember putting it there, and the handwriting, it was unfamiliar, yet it struck a strange chord within me, as if I had seen it before. The edges were creased from age, but there was no sign of how it had ended up in my possession. I unfolded the paper carefully, my fingers trembling slightly. My eyes scanned the list that was written there, names of places I had never visited, yet somehow, I knew them. The first on the list was a cafe, one I had never heard of, but the moment I read the name, memories began to surface, memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. I could picture myself there, sitting at a small table, the rain tapping softly against the windows, a warm cup of coffee cradled in my hands. I could feel it, taste it, yet I had never been to this place. Not in this life. The next name on the list was a park. Secluded, surrounded by tall trees and quiet paths. I had never seen it, never even heard of it, yet as I read the description, I could almost smell the pine in the air, hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. My mind raced to piece it together, but the memories refused to line up with reality. How could I know these places so intimately when I had never been to them? The list went on, each name bringing more images, vivid, real, as if they had been waiting for me to remember. An old bookstore with towering shelves, a bakery that always smelled of fresh bread, a street corner with a fountain where I had once sat, watching people pass by. But none of it made sense. I knew these places, yet I had never visited them. How could that be? I sat down on my bed, clutching the paper, my mind a whirlwind. I had no explanation for this. I searched through my bag again, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain how this paper had ended up there. But there was nothing. No clue. No hint. Only the list and the unsettling sense that something was terribly wrong. The places, they weren't just names on a piece of paper, they were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a life that didn't belong to me. Yet, I could see myself in those places. I could feel myself walking those paths, browsing those shelves, sitting in that cafe. It was as if my body had been there before, even though my mind had never made the journey. The unease gnawed at me, settling into the pit of my stomach. The list felt like a whisper, urging me to visit these places, not because I wanted to, but because something, some force, was compelling me to go. I tried to ignore the pull, but it was impossible. As the day slipped into evening, I decided to follow the list. I had to. I had no choice. I headed out for the cafe first. It wasn't far, just a few blocks away. As I walked, a strange familiarity settled over me, like I had walked this street 100 times before. I didn't even have to think about the turns. My feet seemed to know the way, as if they had been here before. When I reached the cafe, I froze. It was exactly as I had imagined it, small and cozy, with a faded sign above the door. I stood there, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open as I stepped inside, the bell chiming softly. The atmosphere was just as I had pictured it, dim lighting, the warm scent of brewed coffee, the soft hum of conversation from the few patrons scattered around. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. I walked up to the counter, my eyes scanning the room for something, anything, that might trigger a memory. The barista looked up at me with a smile, one that seemed oddly familiar, yet I couldn't place her. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. I hesitated, stammering, "Do you have any specials?" Her smile deepened, as if she knew exactly what I meant. "You're just in time for our seasonal special, a caramel macchiato. It's one of our favorites." I nodded, suddenly feeling like I had heard about this drink before, like I had ordered it countless times. She made the drink quickly and handed it to me with a nod. My hands shook as I took the cup, the warmth of it grounding me as I moved to a nearby table. I sat down, my mind reeling. I was in this place, a place I had never been, but it felt like home. I took a sip of the macchiato, the taste rich and comforting. For a moment, everything felt right, like I belonged here. But then, something shifted. A voice. Soft, clear, and unmistakably familiar, whispered inside my mind. It wasn't my own thought, but it felt meant for me. "You know the way," it said. I froze, my heart racing. I glanced around the cafe, but no one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. I looked back down at my drink, the voice still echoing in my head. "You've been here before. You just don't remember." My skin crawled. I couldn't breathe. How was this possible? How could I have been here before if I had no memory of it? I needed answers. Without thinking, I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I left the cafe quickly, my mind spinning. Outside, the street was quiet, the cool evening air biting against my skin. I pulled the scrap of paper from my bag again and looked at the remaining places listed on it: the bookstore, the bakery, the park. They all called to me, and deep down, I knew I had to visit them, not because I wanted to, but because something inside me was demanding it. I followed the list, visiting each place in turn. The more I visited, the more memories surfaced, memories I had never lived, but that felt like they belonged to me. I could almost see myself there, as if these places had existed in a past life, one I had forgotten, but which was now pulling me back. Finally, I arrived at the last place on the list, a small, secluded park, hidden behind old buildings. The air felt different here, heavier somehow. As I walked deeper into the trees, I felt a strange pull, like something was waiting for me. At the center of the park, I found a bench, worn and weathered by time. There, sitting on the bench, was a small envelope, addressed to me. My heart stopped. I opened it, hands trembling, and read the note inside. "You've remembered now. You can leave." The air around me seemed to shift. The sky above had grown darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I stood there, the weight of the note sinking in. I had been led here for a reason, but now that I was here, I didn't know what to do. The answer had always been there, lurking just out of reach, but I couldn't grasp it. I had to leave. But something told me that, no matter where I went from here, I would never be the same again. Story 10. The sun had just begun its slow climb over the horizon, casting long, pale beams through the blinds, bathing my house in a soft, comforting glow. Everything was still, too still. There was an eerie quiet that filled the air, a kind of hushed expectancy, as though the world was holding its breath. I stretched, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, the soft ache in my joints reminding me that the day had started. But something felt off. I couldn't quite place it, but it was there, hanging like a shadow just outside my peripheral vision. I forced my feet to move toward the kitchen, needing the familiar warmth of my morning coffee to ground me. As I passed through the living room, everything looked just as it had the night before, untouched, familiar. But the feeling that something was amiss lingered like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. When I reached the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was the counter. There, right where I always left my keys and phone, was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't just any paper, it was perfectly placed, sitting in a way that made it impossible not to see. At first, I thought it was something I had forgotten, maybe a note to myself. But as I reached for it, a strange unease swept through me. My fingers hesitated as I unfolded the paper. The message was brief, but its impact was immediate and chilling: "Don't drink the water." I froze. The word sat there, like a dark omen, and a cold shiver crawled down my spine. The note felt off. It felt like it was written for someone else, someone who had no idea what was happening. But the handwriting, this familiar, looping scrawl, it was mine. It was exactly how I wrote, the same pressure on the paper, the same curve to the letters. But I hadn't written this. I couldn't have. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me like a wave. I had never seen this note before, and yet here it was, sitting in my kitchen as if I had written it in my sleep. I looked around the room, my heart pounding. The house was still. I hadn't touched anything in here yet. I hadn't even turned on the faucet for my coffee. But there it was, this message, this warning, sitting on my counter, chilling me to the bone. I glanced over at the glass of water I had left on the counter the night before. It was the same glass I always drank from in the morning, the one I had left out to remind myself to hydrate. The words of the note echoed in my head like a sinister chant: "Don't drink the water." A cold shudder ran through me. Why had I written this? And why was I warning myself? There was nothing wrong with the water. I had never had any issues with it before. The tap water was always fine, always safe. But the note, my handwriting, couldn't be ignored. I stood there, staring at the glass. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a weird coincidence, to tell myself I was overthinking things. But no, the note didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt deliberate, like someone, or something, knew something I didn't. Something was wrong. I picked up the note again, my fingers trembling as I reread it. The words seemed to burn into my brain, a riddle I couldn't solve. How could I have written this? How? My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe it was some sort of prank, but who could have gotten into my house without me knowing? And why would they use my handwriting? I turned my gaze back to the water. My throat felt dry, and the thirst that had never seemed so urgent before suddenly gripped me. The idea of drinking the water now felt wrong, dangerous, even. But how could I not? My body was screaming for it, urging me to drink, to satisfy the thirst. But my mind was telling me to stay away. I paced the kitchen, my nerves fraying with every step. Was this some kind of twisted joke? Or had I somehow written the note without remembering? No. That didn't make sense either. I would have remembered something like this, something so specific. The silence in the house seemed to press in on me, suffocating, oppressive. I turned back to the counter, my eyes locked on the glass of water. It looked so normal. Clear. Harmless. But the note made it seem like something else, something to fear. Don't drink the water. What if something had been put into it? What if it wasn't just water anymore? I didn't know what to believe. I didn't know who or what to trust anymore. I didn't even know if I could trust myself. My chest tightened, and I had to sit down at the table. My head spun, dizzying me, my heart pounding in my ears. The fear, it grew, pressing in from all sides. I reached for the glass of water again, but this time, it felt like reaching for a forbidden object. My reflection in the kitchen window seemed to leer at me, mocking me. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement behind me, something dark, something shifting in the corner of my vision. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. Nothing. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It had to be nothing. I had to stay calm, to trust my instincts. But then another thought struck me like a punch to the gut, and I froze. What if the note, the warning, was meant to stop me from drinking the water, but that's exactly what I should do? What if it was all a trick, a twisted game meant to lead me into some kind of trap? I was dizzy with indecision. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone from the counter, my hands still shaking. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind, to make sense of all this. I called a friend, desperate for some kind of answer. But the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again, no answer. The panic began to rise in my chest. They had never ignored my calls before. Should I call 911? But what would I say? That I found a note in my handwriting warning me not to drink the water. They'd think I was losing it. I couldn't trust myself, couldn't trust anything. The walls were closing in, and I had to make a decision. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked toward the sink, still clutching the note. The sound of the water flowing was oddly soothing as it filled the glass, but my fear didn't relent. The words on the note still haunted me, "Don't drink the water." I reached for the glass. The cold liquid seemed to beckon, and just as I was about to bring it to my lips, the phone rang. I nearly dropped the glass, my heart leaping into my throat. I snatched up the phone, voice tight with anxiety. "Hello?" I gasped. The voice on the other end was shaky, distant, like someone speaking from a great distance, someone who had been waiting, too. "Don't drink the water," my friend's voice warned, sounding hollow and far off. I froze. I had to make a choice. But now, I wasn't sure if it was too late.